What if one simple act of kindness could rewrite the course of your entire life? In a quiet little town, a struggling single dad walks into a diner with nothing left but hope for his daughter. But when that little girl looks up and calls the waitress Mom, neither of them knows she's hiding a secret that could change everything. A story about how love finds us when we least expect it, and how sometimes the family we're meant to have isn't the one we're born with. It's the one we build. If you believe in second chances, in the quiet magic of kindness, and in stories that heal the heart, don't forget to hit subscribe and join us. You won't want to miss how this one unfolds. Now, let's begin. Knox Mercer gripped the steering wheel tighter as the old pickup truck rumbled down the empty stretch of road, its engine sputtering like it might give up at any moment. The sky had turned a pale shade of winter gray, matching the heaviness sitting on his chest. In the rearview mirror, he glanced back at his daughter, Junie. Her small frame curled beneath a threadbare blanket, her cheeks flushed from the cold. He'd promised her pancakes. It was a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. The last of their savings jingled quietly in the tin can, hidden under the driver's seat. Just enough for a cheap meal and maybe a gallon of gas. The garage he once owned, the life he built, even the little house with the porch swing, all gone. Knox had stopped counting the days since he'd packed up everything they had left into the back of his rusted-out truck. Each town blurred into the next, each day a quiet battle to keep Junie warm, fed, and unaware of just how much they'd lost. "Daddy?" Junie's voice was soft, drowsy. He forced a smile. "Yeah, sweetheart? Are we still gonna get pancakes?" Knox swallowed the knot forming in his throat. "Of course, baby. I promised, didn't I?" She nodded sleepily, trusting him in the way only a 5-year-old could, completely unaware of how close they teetered on the edge. As he turned into the outskirts of a small town, another place he couldn't quite name, a modest diner caught his eye, the Hollow Creek Diner, its neon sign flickering unevenly against the dull afternoon sky. It wasn't much, but it was open, and it looked warm inside. The aroma of coffee and something fried drifted toward him as he pulled into the cracked parking lot. Knox parked, gently waking Junie and scooping her into his arms. She clung to him, her small fingers tangled in his coat collar as he pushed open the diner door, a tiny bell jingling overhead. The place smelled like home, not his home, but the kind of place where people laughed over morning coffee and knew the waitress by name. Booths lined the windows, patched with duct tape but inviting. A jukebox sat quietly in the corner, its silence more comforting than music. A few regulars sipped coffee, glancing up briefly as the cold air swept in. And then there was her, the waitress. She stood behind the counter, wiping down menus, her dark blonde hair tucked beneath a simple headband. Eyes soft but alert, she looked up, and for a moment, Knox felt something shift. Something he couldn't quite name. She offered him a smile. Not the kind people give out of politeness, but something warmer, genuine, like she saw straight through the layers he carried. "Take any seat you like," she said, voice calm, smooth as honey. "Cold out there, isn't it?" Knox nodded, settling Junie into a booth near the window. He slid in across from her, feeling the heat from the old radiator under the table thaw his stiff hands. The waitress approached, pen poised. "What can I get you to?" Knox hesitated, glancing at the menu like it might reveal a secret he didn't know. Everything was a little more expensive than he hoped. Still, Junie's wide eyes were on him. "Pancakes," he said finally, voice low. "Just one order. We'll share." The waitress didn't flinch, didn't question. She just smiled at Junie, and scribbled the order. "Coming right up." As she walked away, Knox let out a quiet breath, leaning back. He didn't expect what came next. Junie, still clutching the blanket around her shoulders, turned toward the waitress's retreating figure. Her eyes brightened, and in a voice filled with innocent certainty, she called softly, "Mommy?" Knox's heart stopped. Every sound in the diner seemed to fade, the clink of coffee cups, the shuffle of footsteps, all silenced in that one breathless moment. The waitress paused mid-step, shoulders tensing just slightly before she glanced back. There was no surprise on her face, no awkwardness, only something deep, almost painful, flickering behind her eyes. She gave Junie the gentlest smile before returning to the kitchen without a word. Knox felt his throat tighten, unsure whether to explain, to apologize, or simply pretend it hadn't happened. But Junie just stared after her, content, like she had found something she'd been missing. He rubbed his hands over his face, exhaling slowly. He didn't know why Junie had said it. Maybe it was the way the waitress moved. Calm, kind, unhurried. Maybe it was the warmth in her voice. Or maybe, just maybe, his little girl was longing so much for a mother that she'd decided to find one herself. Knox's gaze drifted back to the counter, where the waitress was quietly plating pancakes, completely unaware, or so he thought, of how much her simple presence was about to alter the course of their lives. Chapter 2. Pancakes and Paper Napkins. The bell above the diner door jingled again as a gust of cold air slipped inside, but Knox barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on Junie, who sat across from him, her small hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze still trained toward the counter where the waitress had disappeared. Knox reached across the table, brushing a loose curl from Junie's forehead. "Hey, sweetheart," he said softly, trying to sound light, unaffected. "Why'd you call her that?" Junie blinked up at him, her eyes clear and unbothered. "She looks like a mommy," she answered simply, as if that explained everything. Knox's chest tightened. There was no accusation in her voice, no sadness, just the kind of innocent observation children make, not knowing how much weight their words can carry. He forced a smile and squeezed her hand. "That's all right," he murmured. "But remember, not everyone's your mommy, okay?" Junie nodded dutifully, but her eyes flickered back toward the kitchen. Before Knox could say more, the waitress returned, balancing a plate of pancakes and a small bowl of fruit. She moved with a quiet grace, setting the food down without fanfare. Her name tag read Calla, though Knox hadn't noticed before. "I added some extra strawberries," she said casually, giving Junie a wink. On the house, Knox opened his mouth to object, pride and habit ready to leap, but Calla's eyes met his, steady and calm. There was no pity there, only something softer, like she knew arguing would embarrass him more. "Thank you," he said quietly, nodding once. Calla smiled, a small, understanding curve of her lips. "Y'all need anything else? Just holler." As she walked away, Junie dug into the pancakes with enthusiasm, syrup dripping down her chin. Knox sat back, taking in the warm hum of the diner. The smell of coffee, bacon grease, and old linoleum felt oddly comforting, like stepping into a world untouched by the chaos outside. Still, he couldn't shake the strange pull in his chest. Why did this woman, this stranger, seem to stir something inside him he couldn't quite place? He pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on making sure Junie ate her fill. Behind the counter, Calla wiped down a stack of menus, her hands moving mechanically while her mind remained far away. She hadn't expected the little girl's voice to pierce through her like that. Mommy? It wasn't the first time she'd been mistaken for someone she wasn't. But today, the word lingered longer than usual, tugging at memories she kept carefully buried. Her fingers brushed against her stomach instinctively, the old ache flaring for a moment before she pushed it down. This wasn't her life. Here, in Hollow Creek, she was just Calla, not Calla Winslow, heir to a billion-dollar empire, not the woman whose every move was scrutinized by the press or shaped by corporate boardrooms. She'd traded designer heels for a pair of worn sneakers, board meetings for late-night diner shifts, and she liked it better this way. People here didn't know who she was. They didn't care, but the look in that man's eyes, Knox, she thought she'd heard the little girl call him, was hard to ignore. A mix of exhaustion and something deeper, quieter, like he'd been carrying the weight of the world too long without setting it down. She stole another glance at them. Junie giggled, syrup smeared across her cheeks, and Knox reached over with a paper napkin to wipe her face, his rough hands gentle. They didn't look like people passing through. They looked like people searching for something they'd lost, something Calla understood far too well. When Junie finished eating, Knox asked for the check, folding a crumpled $5 bill and a handful of coins onto the table. Calla slipped past, glancing briefly at the small pile. "Don't worry about the extra strawberries," she said lightly, almost like a secret between them. "Consider it a thank you for brightening up my day." Knox looked up, studying her face. There was no ulterior motive in her eyes, just genuine kindness. He wasn't used to it. "Thank you," he said again, his voice quieter this time. Calla nodded, then turned toward Junie. "You be good for your dad now, okay?" Junie grinned, leaning toward her like she wanted to say something else but hesitated. Calla gave her a playful wink before heading back to the counter. Knox stood, scooping Junie into his arms once more. Outside, the wind bit sharper than before. He bundled her tighter, glancing back at the diner as he pushed open the door. For reasons he couldn't explain, he had the oddest urge to stay just a little longer. But pride and survival had taught him not to linger. Not when the world kept moving on without you. Calla watched them leave, her chest tightening in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. There was something about that little girl's eyes, something familiar and raw, and the way Knox looked at her, protective but distant, like he was used to holding the world at arm's length. Calla knew that feeling well. She wiped down another table, the soft sound of the jukebox finally clicking to life in the background. Outside, she caught a glimpse of the truck pulling away down the road, exhaust smoke curling in the cold air. She wondered if she'd see them again. Something told her she would, and something even deeper whispered that maybe, just maybe, they were exactly what she'd been waiting for too. The wind had not let up overnight. By morning, thin sheets of frost painted the diner windows, catching the first light of day in shimmering patterns. Inside, the familiar scent of strong coffee and sizzling bacon swirled in the air as Calla tied her apron behind her back, readying herself for another long shift. But her mind wasn't on the regulars or the clatter of dishes. It kept drifting back to the man and his little girl from the day before. She told herself not to overthink it. People passed through Hollow Creek all the time. Travelers, drifters, those just trying to make it to the next place. But there had been something about Knox Mercer, something in the quiet way he moved, like a man carrying invisible scars, and something in Junie's innocent voice, calling her mommy, still echoed in Calla's chest. She shook the thought away, greeting the early customers as they trickled in. By mid-morning, the bell above the door chimed again. Calla glanced up instinctively and froze. There he was. Knox entered with Junie bundled tightly in his arms, the little girl's face peeking out from beneath a knitted hat, cheeks pink from the cold. Knox's eyes scanned the diner before landing on Calla. He hesitated, then gave a small nod, half acknowledgement, half apology. Calla smiled, feeling something warm flicker inside her despite herself. They took the same booth as yesterday. When Calla approached, notepad ready, Junie grinned wide. "Hi, Mommy." Knox flushed immediately, murmuring under his breath, "Junie?" But Calla only crouched down to Junie's level, her smile soft but steady. "Well, hey there, sweetheart. Glad to see you two back." "No pancakes today?" Knox said, clearing his throat. "Maybe just coffee for me. She's good with a glass of milk." Calla's brows knit together slightly. She glanced at Knox, noting the tight lines at the corners of his mouth. Pride again. She understood it all too well. Without a word, she scribbled down the order and walked away. But as she moved behind the counter, something tugged at her conscience. The hollowness in Knox's eyes was unmistakable. A man doing everything he could to keep his head above water, barely. And she remembered what that used to feel like. 10 minutes later, she returned with more than just coffee. A plate of toast, a bowl of scrambled eggs, and Junie's milk balanced on the tray, along with Knox's coffee steaming in a chipped mug. Knox glanced at the spread, eyebrows lifting. "You didn't order this," Calla said casually, setting everything down. "But sometimes folks need a little extra." Knox opened his mouth to protest, then shut it when he saw Junie's eager face as she reached for the toast. He exhaled, hands wrapping around the coffee cup. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice rough but sincere. Calla gave him a small nod, moving away without waiting for further explanation. Junie munched happily, swinging her feet under the table. Knox watched her, sipping his coffee, but couldn't stop glancing at the waitress. Calla. He had noticed her name today. Something about her unsettled him. Not in a bad way, but in the way someone unfamiliar makes you feel seen when you've spent too long trying to stay invisible. Most folks looked at him and saw trouble. A man with no address, no clean edges. But Calla, she looked like she didn't care about any of that. Knox rubbed his jaw, uneasy. He couldn't afford to get too comfortable. People who smiled too kindly usually wanted something. That's what life had taught him. But when Junie glanced up between bites, eyes bright, he couldn't deny how much lighter she seemed here. He hadn't seen her like that in months. Maybe he could let his guard down, just a little. The morning crowd thinned, and Calla leaned against the counter, refilling salt shakers mechanically. Tess, the diner's manager and her closest confidant in town, wandered over, wiping her hands on a towel. "You've got a soft spot for those two already," Tess murmured knowingly, nodding toward Knox's table. Calla didn't deny it. "Hard not to," she replied quietly. "There's something about them." Tess followed her gaze, her tone gentler. "That man's been through a storm, you can see it plain as day. But he's still holding that little girl together like it's all he's got left." Calla nodded, feeling the truth of it settle in her chest. Tess added, almost offhand, "You know, we always need odd jobs done around here. Plumbing's been fussy. Could use someone handy." Calla looked at her sharply, realizing the offer wasn't random. Tess shrugged. "You said you didn't want anyone knowing who you are, but you can still help in your own way, Calla." Calla glanced back at Knox, something stirring deep inside her. Maybe Tess was right. Maybe she could help, quietly, gently, without revealing the pieces of herself she wasn't ready to share. Later, when Knox stood to leave, Calla approached before he could gather Junie's coat. "Hey," she said lightly, eyes meeting his. "If you're looking for a little work, we could use someone handy around here. Nothing big, just a few repairs." Knox blinked, surprised. "You offering me a job?" She shrugged. I'm offering you something to keep busy. Up to you. He hesitated, clearly weighing pride against practicality. Junie tugged on his sleeve. Daddy, can we stay here more? She asked softly. Knox's eyes flickered, his jaw tightening. Finally, he nodded once. Sure, I'll take a look. Calla smiled, but didn't push further. As they left, the bell chimed again, and for a moment, it felt like something invisible had shifted in the air. She didn't know yet how much this small offer would change all their lives, but in her heart, something told her it already had. The next morning dawned colder than usual. A fine mist clung to the edges of Hollow Creek, hovering over rusted rooftops and empty lots like a memory no one could quite shake off. Knox zipped up his jacket, hands numb as he tightened the last bolt on his truck's front wheel. He had spent most of the night in the cab, Junie asleep curled beside him. The thin blanket and cracked window panes had done little against the creeping chill. His mind kept circling back to the waitress, Calla, and her offer. He'd accepted, though part of him still bristled at the idea of being anyone's charity project. But work was work. Junie deserved better than restless nights in a pickup bed, and if fixing a leaky pipe bought them a few hot meals, so be it. He glanced at Junie now, tugging her mittens on with determined focus. Ready, sweetheart? She nodded, grinning through chapped lips. We're going to see Mommy again? Knox's chest tightened. He crouched, adjusting her scarf. She's not your mommy, remember? Junie only smiled innocently, unfazed. Knox straightened, swallowing down the ache lodged in his throat. He didn't have the heart to correct her again. By the time they arrived at the diner, Calla was already wiping down the counters, her hair tucked messily beneath her headband. She looked up as they entered, warmth flickering in her eyes. You made it, she said simply. Knox gave a curt nod. You said something needed fixing? Tess, wiping her hands nearby, chimed in. Sink in the back's been leaking for weeks, and that light in the storage room's on its last leg. Knox shrugged off his jacket. I'll take a look. Junie settled herself into their usual booth, already reaching for a crayon from the little plastic container on the table. Calla slid a glass of milk in front of her without a word. Knox followed Tess to the kitchen, rolling up his sleeves. It didn't take long to see the sink was a mess, decades-old piping, patched more times than he could count. He got to work without complaint, glad for something physical to focus on. The wrench in his hands felt familiar, almost comforting. In the quiet hum of the kitchen, with pots clinking faintly in the background, he let his mind drift. Back to the garage he once owned, the smell of grease and engine oil, the sound of Junie's laughter echoing through the open bay door while her mother watched nearby. He worked faster, shutting the memory down before it could swallow him. Calla kept glancing toward the back, listening to the occasional clang of tools. There was something grounding about the way Knox moved. Efficient, steady, no wasted effort. She admired that. Admired how he carried the weight of his struggles without letting it show. And Junie, coloring quietly at the table, had a way of lighting up the entire diner. Tess nudged Calla gently as she passed by, murmuring, "You've got a soft spot, honey." Calla didn't deny it. Maybe it was because she saw echoes of herself in them. How easily life could strip you down to your bare bones, and how hard it was to keep standing after. Or maybe, if she was honest, it was because she missed the feeling of belonging somewhere, even if just for a moment. By late afternoon, Knox emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a rag. "Sink's patched for now. You'll need a new fitting eventually." Tess smiled. "You've saved us a small fortune."